We are going to welcome our next panel, Holocaust Remembrance and the Study of Antisemitism, the Power and Potential of Public Dialogue. On this panel, we have the opportunity to welcome Susan Abrams, the CEO of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, Father Patrick Desbois, President of Yahad-In Unum, Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, Tali Nates, founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Dr. Toby Simpson, director of the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and this panel will be moderated by Dr. Stephen Smith, the Viterbi Endowed Executive Director at USC Shoah Foundation. As I turn this over to Stephen for the panel, I just want to add a note of thanks. I have had the pleasure and privilege of working with each of you in a number of ways over these many years, and I want to commend you for your service to the field and the community, and thank you for all that you're doing each and every day. Stephen, the stage is yours.
Michael, thank you. And thank you for putting on this amazing event today, and an important one in our world. I am not going to waste the little time that we have doing long introductions, because you can find information about all of our panelists in the chat, and I would encourage you to do so. We're going to have a conversation here about the way in which public institutions, which includes Holocaust museums and archives, bridge the gap between the past and the present. And the overarching question I think we're going to be addressing here is, how do we teach about an anti-Semitic past in an anti-Semitic present? Because all of our panelists here are actively working in the public domain with learners and educators, faculty, and all sorts of people who communicate in the world in which we live today. So I want to start, first of all, with you, Susan Abrams from Illinois. Welcome. You have a wonderful museum there in Illinois. How do you depict the anti-Semitic past, that is the precursors to the Holocaust, the final solution, in the museum space that you have?
Thanks, Stephen. I think it's an interesting question, and having seen many of my colleagues' museums, I think we do less of that actually than many. And so I think to your point, as we're addressing this incredible and ongoing rise of anti-Semitism now, that maybe that's something that our museum could take a look at, of providing more of that long-term historical context. Most of how we take it on is in the build-up to the Holocaust.
Directly. Toby, you oversee the world's oldest archive of the Nazi era at the Wiener Library in London. And Dr. Alfred Wiener, as we know, started collecting on day one and perhaps before. So tell me about how you now, in the current day, as you look back at that vast corpus of material that you have, how do you bring that to the attention of the public through your library, all of those precursors that led up to the Holocaust itself?
Well, I think we are quite inspired by the example of the founder of the library, Dr. Alfred Wiener, because he was one of the first really to perceive just how extreme and dangerous Nazi ideology was, and how it, for example, in texts like Hitler's Mein Kampf, how it set out as a vision of the future in which the Jews had no place, and in which they were sort of set as the Germany's arch enemy. And the fact that Wiener noticed that so early on meant that he started gathering a huge range of material that could warn the wider world about the Nazis and their anti-Semitism. And the reason he did that was because he believed that often you needed tangible evidence in order to really open people's eyes. And so he believed that showing people the extremism in Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda was one way to make people take things seriously. And so he was even warning politicians in Weimar Germany about how catastrophic it would be if the Nazis were ever given power. So in that sense, we continue to pursue that vision today in all sorts of different ways at the library. But I certainly believe that the collection that Wiener amassed and then his colleagues continued to build on in later decades gives us an extraordinary tangible insight into the different forms of anti-Semitism and how it pervaded everyday life in Germany before the Nazis, but also under the Nazis.
I think we'll come back to this theme a little later, Toby, because I think your point is really interesting, that Alfred Wiener was trying to prevent the Holocaust without actually any knowledge of it. And I've, even in my very slim collection that I have here at home, I have multiple books from the 1930s that talk about preventing anti-Semitism long before, in the 10 years before it. So I think it's a really interesting model that you have there. We'll come back to. Mary Pat, you've got one of the newest Holocaust museums. I know the Holocaust Museum has a long tradition in Dallas, but one of the newest facilities that have been recently built. How have you, in building the new facility in Dallas, thought about how you incorporate the history of anti-Semitism at the time and its link to the Holocaust itself? How did you go about that?
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here with you all. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Michael, for including me in this conversation. So as we were designing our new permanent exhibition, we wanted to be sure to orient our visitors to the history of the Jewish people and the history of anti-Semitism before we introduce the Holocaust, because the majority of our visitors are not Jewish. The majority of school children who come to the museum are not Jewish. And so we do it rather quickly, but there is an overview going back to the accusations of that the Jews were responsible for the murder of Christ, and explain that Nostra Aetate didn't happen until 1965, I believe. And people are always taken aback by that, and before they enter the Holocaust. And of course, there is, a complete explanation in that wing of Hitler's ideology is how they start Nazi Germany, and how anti-Semitism played a role in people's response, whether or not they were upstanders and would risk their lives to help their Jewish neighbors, or whether or not they were in fact perpetrators, bystanders, or perpetrators. And then when we are in our genocide gallery and we're looking at the 10 stages of those stages were in the Holocaust to reinforce the evolution of civil and human rights in the United States, there's a strand on religious liberty. And we look at examples of religious freedom, George Washington's letter, welcoming to the rabbi and welcoming religious liberty early on, but then examples of anti-Semitism through our country's history.
Well, thank you, Mary Pat. Father Patrick Desbois, you've been spending many years now documenting the witnesses, the eyewitnesses to the Holocaust right across Central and Eastern Europe. And thank you very much for all that you have done to do that. It's sacred work for us all. To what extent in your work have you discovered in the testimonies and the conversations that you have had that there was anti-Semitism that was present in those testimonies, or that anti-Semitism might have been to some degree conditioning the response of the communities that you have interviewed?
Yes, across the 8,000 interview we did, it's sure that we saw many times, I would say, the criminal anti-Semitism. It means people who participated willingly to kill their family neighbors. And I think, unfortunately, as in Western Europe, we come back now to criminal anti-Semitism. It means people who are kicking a Jew, killing a Jew. It's completely another step. So I try to show how people take responsibility themselves in doing crimes, as today there are people taking responsibility in attacking a Jew, burning a synagogue, etc. And but I would say it's so evident I have thousands of interviews of people who were so proud to have been killing Jews themselves, not without German and without attack.
And when you hear those accounts, Father Desbois, how do you react to that personally, and how do you confront that reality within the interview?
The problem is that we try to hide what we think because we want the evidence of the crimes, and also to know, by example, one guy, he had many Jews buried in his garden, and he finished by saying it, or another one, he shot 223 Jews himself. So as we are investigating, we don't show anything about what we think. But after, when we reveal this video to young generation, like in Georgetown or like in our museum in Guatemala, people identify with the violence they see with today. And they realize that anti-Semitism is a criminal ideology. It's not only to hate the Jews, it's sooner or later to attack them and even to kill them.
Yeah. Tali Nates, you're in Johannesburg and have a wonderful museum there. Congratulations on recently opening that and all the work you've been doing. You're working in a community that has virtually, a very small Jewish community, and the vast majority of the visitors that come to your museum experience racism in other ways within the society. How do you relay the anti-Semitism of the past in the context of a society which has many racisms in the present?
It's a great question. And of course, South Africa, that is relatively new democracy, only 27 years into democracy, where we experience a racist state in many ways, parallels even to Nazi laws, to Nazi propaganda in others. It is interesting for the visitors to study the Holocaust almost as an entry point to understand themselves. It's very hard, still very difficult to speak about our own history. Our own history is very painful. Perpetrators are still living side by side next to victims. Apartheid, of course, lasted for officially 44 years, but the pains of colonialism, of racism before, of atrocities before is still here. And in a way, South Africa was never highly anti-Semitic. There was always someone else to blame. There was always other scapegoats. There were always others that were more hated than the Jew. So when I say the Holocaust is in a way an entry point, it allows many of the students, the young students, it is compulsory to study about the Holocaust, by the way, in South Africa. Every grade 9, every 14 years old have to study about the Holocaust. And by speaking about the Holocaust, by speaking about anti-Semitism, about hatred of the other, there is an identification with this other that you don't speak about, with your parents, with your society, with your community. And there is an openness to speak about yourself. So it is an interesting way of allowing a conversation about your own painful history and confronting your own painful past.
So on our panel today, we've got two of you that focus specifically on curating, overseeing archives. And if you include me, that's 3. And we've got 3 of us who, are curating archives into museums for public display and education. I'd just like to spend a few moments now looking at that relationship between the archival content we have and the educational programs that we create in terms of the bridge to the public. And maybe Dr. Simpson, I can come to you first and ask you, with the Wiener Library, do you have public programs or do you feed into other entities that have programs? How do you bridge the archive into the educational environment?
Thank you, Stephen. There are a few different ways. We do have our own educational programs, but they're relatively small scale. And one of the things we try to do is offer something special to the teachers and the students that come to the library. And we very often take them into the archive stores. And I have to say the impact of seeing the documents stacked up so high on the shelves and running for so many meters really is quite unforgettable for students. And I think that's important, but of course, it's not everybody can have that experience, especially in a small space like ours. but what we do is we try to act strategically. So there are other, in the UK context, there are other organisations which work with larger numbers of school students. Of course, Stephen Betchelom and the National Holocaust Centre is one of them, which regularly has large school groups visit. Another major organisation is the Holocaust Educational Trust, which organises for trips to Auschwitz and for survivors to go into schools. And then an organisation that we work quite closely with is the University College London Centre for Holocaust Education. And they are the leading organisation working with teachers. And there's a programme of beacon schools which set out an example of good practice in teaching about the Holocaust across the UK. And we worked especially closely with them recently to create a textbook called Understanding the Holocaust, which is now very widely used in schools. And the thing that really pleased me about that project was that very many stories from our archives were included as examples in that textbook. So for example, we have an amazing collection of photographs by a Jewish woman photographer called Gertie Simon. And she was forced into exile in the 1930s, and her works were subsequently rediscovered. But her story is an amazing way of describing the Jewish refugee experience. And it's now made its way into this textbook, which is very widely used in schools. And there's such a richness in archives. There's such an extraordinary wealth of stories and perspectives. And I think it's through working in partnership that we have the greatest impact, probably.
Father Desbois, we've talked a lot together about the urgency of your mission to collect testimonies while there is still time versus the beginning of how you use that archival collection in an educational context, like you do at Georgetown with your amazing program there. How do you balance the urgency to collect material like we just were hearing, which is unique in the world of Holocaust studies and archives, and the way in which you then take that content into the educational environment?
That's the challenge of our organization. In one way, to find the last witness, we try to accelerate as much as we can. And on the other way, to develop teaching program like in Guatemala or like in Georgetown or in Europe. But what is changing for us, I teach in Georgetown since 7 years. Majority of students are not Jew. They know actually nothing about Holocaust. Even in Georgetown, they know Hitler and Auschwitz, and that's it. And so we have to begin from scratch. And secondly, we have to prove it existed. And so for me, we try for each archive, each picture to say, do you think this picture is true? Do you think it's an Holocaust picture? Why? How do you see there are Jews? Are you sure? Etc., etc. So I think we are confronted to a new challenge because this generation will see no more survivors and a lot of deniers all around. So we cannot, as I say, you cannot teach Holocaust like you teach Napoleon. Nobody denies Napoleon crimes. But the Jews, it will be all over the planet. So I think we have to train people like investigating and raising even complicated questions. By example, I was in Babi Yar, and because I work also with the Museum of Babi Yar now, and we revealed for the first time 159 names of killers. Until now, nobody knew who killed the Jews in Babi Yar. They say they have been killed. And so actually, I say that because there is a lot of things that we can investigate. And I think the young generation are interesting to investigate because they see a lot of fictions in America, like Cold Case, like X-Files, like Criminal Mind. They are used to that. But if we repeat endlessly, Jews have been killed, they say, okay, and we will meet a lot of people, so it's not sure.
Yeah, actually, this is probably a good moment, Mary Pat, for us to talk about the conversation that's ensued this week, I think from Texas, around the comments that were made in Southlake, Texas, about bringing opposing views or discussing opposing views on the Holocaust, which I think shocked a lot of people to see that somebody senior in the school district would suggest to teachers that they might do that. I know that was not a policy per se, but it was something that came out. How have you responded to that within your museum, and how would you respond to our audience today about whether or not we teach opposing views on the Holocaust?
Well, hopefully you all can hear me. I'm having internet issues today, but you know, we were horrified to learn about that when the tape was leaked. Actually, one of the teachers that leaked the tape has been to our professional development, and so she was horrified, and that's what led her to release it. But you know, I think the underlying problem is not as much, and well, the underlying problem is about this legislation, and you know, that was, and the people that created the legislation, I don't believe were envisioning it being used to keep people from teaching the history of the Holocaust. It was in response to fears about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you know, critical race theory, which is not being taught, but there was a concern about that. I think you know, all of us can appreciate that even though that legislation was not geared at the Holocaust, the first example would be a teacher saying that we needed to teach an opposing view to the Holocaust, and that, you know, tells you how deeply rooted anti-Semitism is. But you know, we have spoken out against that. We've issued a statement. I actually was able to, you know, do several interviews with media, you know, to express why it's such a concern. That, you know, as we all know, the Holocaust is one of the most well-documented historical events in our time. And the fact that a teacher could even begin to think that it was controversial and that there would be an opposing view that might need to be taught is pretty horrifying. But I think that the problem is legislation that says that teachers need to provide an opposing view about controversial topics opens the door to bias and prejudice. And that's what we saw. And I don't think it will be the last instance. We're trying to mobilize people to speak out. And fortunately, among the Jewish community, but also among lots of other partners that we have, people are speaking out and saying, you know, that we cannot risk letting our students, letting history be misrepresented to students by showing opposing views to historical fact.
Yeah, thank you for that. Susan Abrams, your museum was founded in Skokie, Illinois, precisely because there was a movement in the 1970s that was, you know, not only denying the Holocaust, but also, you know, at the forefront of anti-Semitism. Tell us a little bit about that founding and how that has informed the way in which your museum continues to act in the present while teaching about the past.
Yep. So Stephen is, of course, referencing the proposed neo-Nazi march in the late 70s in Skokie, Illinois, where our museum is located. And it had at the time, I believe, the largest number of survivors outside of Israel in a specific community. And so these survivors, most of whom hadn't been speaking of the Holocaust and just focused on moving on with their lives, learning a livelihood, raising a family, all of a sudden confronted in their own safe community in the United States. And so they started to raise their voices and raise resources, speaking out, carrying bats, fighting it in all different ways with a number of different allies. But really what they realized is that education is the best antidote to hatred and bigotry. And that led ultimately to the founding of what became Illinois Holocaust Museum, which you can see behind me. And it also led them to start to lobby our legislators. And Illinois, one thing that we can be proud of in Illinois is that Illinois was the first state in the country to mandate the study of the Holocaust. And I think some of how it manifests itself, Stephen, to get to the second part of your question, is our great use of testimonials of first person eyewitnesses to speak of their experiences before, during, and after the Holocaust, and in traditional ways, and in partnership with USC Shoah Foundation, with Dimensions in Testimony, with virtual reality film experiences. So, but as much as we possibly can with our Speakers Bureau, while they can, both at our museum and beyond our walls. And as we've all seen during the pandemic, as we've pivoted to to virtual, that our coffee with a conversation now can reach, globally. So I think that's a good thing. And we're now talking to many of our peer institutions about how do we keep that as frequent as possible by working together to share the stories of the survivors in each of our communities.
Yeah, thank you for that, Susan. I remember coming to the museum not long after the new museum opened and being very impressed by the fact that the survivors of the Holocaust, that were the volunteers and the docents there, were extremely comfortable speaking about contemporary events and issues. And I'd not really experienced that in that way very often, because of course I've been involved in genocide studies for a long time, and I would often I find myself in a position where I was feeling some pushback from the survivors, or at least some inquiry as to why we might be doing that. Whereas I did find that was very deeply embedded in the culture of the museum and driven by the survivors, which was very, very interesting and impressive. But Tali, in Johannesburg, not only are you working in a post-apartheid country, but you're also working in a country where genocide has happened recently, like in Rwanda. And I know that you have refugees from Rwanda in Johannesburg and around South Africa. So how do you relate the anti-Semitism of the past, which was experienced by the Jews, as a genocidal, as Father Desbois said, criminal, genocidal, lethal anti-Semitism, and see that alongside the genocidal, lethal racism that there was, say, for example, in Rwanda, or maybe even going back further in Namibia with the Hereras? How do you balance those more local experiences to Africa with the non-local experience of the Holocaust, which happened in Europe?
First of all, I just want to mention the Nelson Mandela exhibition that was just at you, Suzanne, and just to emphasize how appreciative we are for the work that you are doing. And Stephen, for your very good question, when we thought about a museum in South Africa, it was very clear that it cannot not talk about next door, Southwest Africa, today Namibia, that was, by the way, under South African control from 1916 to 1990. We speak about the German control of Southwest Africa and the genocide of the Herero and Nama. We seem to forget, and also we seem to forget in South Africa, that we controlled neighboring Namibia and we implemented apartheid in neighboring Namibia, but we seem to do something that is very comfortable and to say that wasn't us, it was another regime that was unjust and it wasn't us. Can we even imagine Germany today say that, it was another regime, it wasn't us, it wasn't in our name. So for sure, when we started to speak about looking at the Holocaust and genocide, it had to be about genocide in Africa. It had to be about Rwanda. It had to be about Namibia. And Rwanda, more than anything, was a parallel story, because in April of 1994, when the genocide was happening in Rwanda, we voted for Nelson Mandela. We voted for our first democratic president. And that is something that we need to look at. There were refugees that came to South Africa from Rwanda. There were many that came for medical treatment in South Africa, and then some of them stayed. So when going back to the original questions about archives, when we started to do our collections, it was very important not only to interview and collect from Holocaust survivors, but we had to collect from Tutsi survivors that came to Johannesburg. We had to collect their stories, their photographs, the oral testimonies, and so on. And finally, I think to look at your question about anti-Semitism and racism or other forms that led to genocide, when we created the permanent exhibition, again, we had to think about where do you tell the story of anti-Semitism, and it couldn't be in one place. it had to be in few places. So for example, to understand genocide, you had to understand also who is targeted by genocide and why. So the Jews were targeted by genocide. Why? Because of anti-Semitism. But why were Tutsi targeted by genocide? And explain that, or explain the Armenian case study or the Namibian case study and so on. And then when you tell the stories in each one of the galleries, you go back to telling the story of anti-Semitism or anti-Tutsi sentiments or anti-Herero, Nama sentiment and so on. What we found is that the audiences, the South African audiences, and now globally too, because we all moved online, as Susan said, and that allowed us to have wider discussions. But finally, just to say that the South African audiences are really reacting to all those case studies, and they are looking at anti-Semitism as anti-Semitism, at racism as racism. They're not mixing the two. They are needing to understand every case study, and from each and every case study, they learn something about themselves. Othering, in inverted comma, is very common in South Africa. The new enemy is the African migrants. So Afrophobia or xenophobia is very high in South Africa in the last 10 to 12 years. And discussion about anti-Semitism or racism or anti-Tutsi sentiment is very important to allow audiences and students to speak about the elephant in the room that no one wants to speak about, but we have to speak about because violence is happening all the time against African migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers.
Thank you, Tali. Well, with the 10 minutes or so that we've got, I'd like to have a final round of discussion, just really to tease out a little bit more. So how do we teach about an anti-Semitic past in an anti-Semitic present? Those of you who've followed some of my commentary on the current day anti-Semitism will know that I don't like the word anti-Semitism because it was created by anti-Semites. I much prefer to use the word anti-Jewish hatred. And I also feel very strongly that a little earlier, Father Desbois mentioned criminal anti-Semitism, and I really like that you clarified, Father Desbois, that's a particular form of anti-Semitism. And so we're living in a world today where we're seeing many different forms of anti-Semitism that sit on a spectrum. I always take the view, panelists, that when I see graffiti on the wall that says Jack loves Jane, I go, oh, okay, that's nice. That's street art. And when I see the Jews to the gas, I go, that's genocidal rhetoric. And that will end up with somebody being murdered. Because anti-Semitism, as we know from the past, cannot ever be not genocidal, because we know that it leads to the genocide of Jewish people. So I'd like to bring that into context for our final round to say, in view of the types of anti-Semitism we're seeing today, how do you as institutions deal with it? I'll come to you first of all, Dr. Toby Simpson. You've been collecting since the 1930s. Do you still collect today content that's related to anti-Semitism, including perhaps some of the anti-Semitism we've been seeing coming out of Britain in the last few years, both sort of political and anti-Zionist, anti-Semitism? Are you still collecting, and how do you decide your policies around that?
We are still collecting, and we do focus more on physical material rather than online archiving. And of course, one of the challenges for anyone who's trying to document hatred today is the sheer scale of, I suppose, written anti-Semitic statements online. And there are, of course, organizations out there that do online archiving on a mass scale. That's not really what we do, but a good example of the kind of literature that we gather. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of things, but one example is there is I think, concerning trend of I suppose you could call populist nationalism across the world, but it also manifests itself in Germany. And there's a magazine which we've been collecting for decades called Der Freiwillige, which was originally produced by an organization of former SS officers, and although it doesn't contain explicit Holocaust denial, it celebrates the Wehrmacht, and is full of sort of military nostalgia. And that has sort of morphed recently into other titles, and has actually become more widespread in recent years. And I was shocked. I recently went over to Berlin just this year to visit the Jewish Museum's new exhibition, and I found one of these magazines on sale in the Relay newsagent in the Berlin airport, and my complaint is still awaiting an answer, because I am working with the German embassy to get a serious answer from this newsagent, because a magazine celebrating the deeds of the Wehrmacht during World War II should not be on sale in Berlin airport. And that's just one example. As I say, it has to be a joint effort, because keeping a record of what's going on today around the world is no small task. And I mean, you talked quite rightly about the dangers of anti-Semitism and what we can do. I mean, I still think our educational role is so important, because there is a difference between people who are ignorant about Jews, perhaps, or perhaps hold one or two prejudices and are open to education, and people who are hardcore anti-Semites and who are disseminating hateful propaganda, and who are, quite often either involved in or planning potentially criminal anti-Semitism. So I think we need to remember that the more people that are out there who are, I suppose, educated about the dangers of anti-Semitism, the more likely we are to be able to mobilize effective opposition to anti-Semites, who are the real danger here, I think.
Thank you for that. Father Patrick Desbois, you're a Catholic priest and have dedicated your life to documenting the Holocaust. But I have a question for you just about Christian anti-Semitism and Christianity in its relationship to the Jews more generally. Are things improving over time in terms of how the Christian world is dealing with its anti-Semitism, do you think? Or do we still have work to be done there?
Sad to say, I live in a very secular country called France. So the anti-Semite now don't refer to Jesus, but more to say ultra-right because they hate the Jews are foreigners, ultra-left because they hate the Jews as capitalists, or terrorist organization who hate the Jews because they are Jews. And this anti-Semitism is inside also some Christian, because Christians are first French in my country, and I think in Western Europe. But I think my thinking is that we have also to try to train people. I think a minimum of people will be leading this fight after us. Because on the other side, on the anti-Semite side, they train young people. All terrorists who attack Jews in France are very young. Nobody is 30 years old. The ultra-right also is training people very young, ultra-left also. And so we have a challenge to train young leaders to fight in front of that. Otherwise, we'll be defeated, I would say, concerning the age of the fighters. And I'm so happy also that we brought these voices of the neighbors. We cooperate both with Tali Nates in Johannesburg, both in Dallas and both in Skokie. And you know what, I will tell you the truth, what happened to us, the French government asked us to investigate about the crimes against the Jews today. And so we went in the suburb of Paris and we made the same investigation. And it was really difficult because suddenly it appeared a mix between mass Islam ideology, but also drug cartels, but also jealousy. And I will never forget that they decided to kill a couple and they only raped the woman and they didn't kill the man, only because this Jewish family had advertised they wanted to buy a beautiful car. And so it was the beginning of the problem, and it was finishing but an awful attack for a poor couple who was very damaged. So I say, I love the expression of Tali Nates, the elephant in the room. I think the elephant of the room that everybody is afraid is the violence, the criminal violence of today. We're trying to turn around above to avoid to speak about it. But if we begin to study it frankly, we can win, because on the other side, there are so many young people who are not afraid to do it. And so let's be very practical and train a minority of young leaders, because we will miss leaders tomorrow to make this fight.
Mary Pat, when visitors leave your museum and they go back to their daily lives, they might encounter anti-Semitism and other forms of racism in their lives. How do you equip them to know what to look for and how to respond?
Stephen, the permanent exhibition at the museum is focused on impacting behavior and helping think about their responsibility to be upstanders when they encounter prejudice and hatred or anti-Semitism. The definition of an upstander is the first thing that they see as they start the exhibitionary journey. And really, throughout the entire exhibition, we're holding up people who stood up for themselves or who stood up for others, and encouraging students to do that. And all of our continuing education is based on this concept of upstander behavior. So it's our hope that when they witness it, that they will stand up and speak up, and that they will know that one person can make a difference, and that oftentimes it just takes one person to stand up and speak up, particularly, in a school setting. It's very easy to be the bystander, but it's much harder to be an upstander. But to supplement their understanding of anti-Semitism, we've developed a short video that really explains the history of anti-Semitism that we send to teachers and encourage them to watch with their students before they come to the museum. And our educators have developed a toolkit that's online, that's accessible, that gives guidance for parents, for educators, for students, for school administrators, with reading materials, but very concrete definitions of anti-Semitism. And we hope that when they encounter that, they'll go to the toolkit, that they'll read the IHRA definition, and then look at those examples that are in that definition, and really be able to say, yes, this is anti-Semitism and I need to speak out against it. And if we're doing anything right, we're encouraging them to speak up and say, this isn't right.
Susan Abrams, today, we know how this project that you began in the 1970s started, but if the young people that leave your museum, what kind of anti-Semitisms are they likely to encounter in Illinois, and how do you equip them? I think you're muted, Susan.
We do similar things that Mary Pat was just speaking of. We developed a Confronting Hate toolkit in 2019 in response to a 90% increase in inquiries from educators and administrators, parents too, asking what they can do about the anti-Semitism and sometimes I would say right up there with it, anti-Black hatred that was being experienced in their communities. We've also developed courageous conversation workshops for the similar audiences, administrators and educators, also for parents. And now it's going into the corporate world too, where they're interested in fostering conversations on difficult subjects. None of us can get away from that in pretty much any sphere right now. We also we try to tie everything to our world today, making the connections from history. And we do that, of course, through our exhibitions, including the special exhibitions that either go deeper into aspects of the Holocaust that are lesser known, but also broader into other areas of social justice and human rights. So Tali mentioned that we just had Mandela's struggle for freedom, and now we have an exhibition on LGBTQ. But by connecting and having people see how these hatreds connect, and it doesn't start or end with one group. And I think that helps people to develop empathy and an understanding for our common humanity, and giving them the tools, as Mary Pat referenced, to speak up for themselves and for others.
Michael, you just gave me the most amazing hour of my life. Thank you so much. I wish we'd had 4 hours. We're just getting started. So if you got any space later in the day, invite us back. You know, I'm always aware that at the Shoah Foundation, there are over 50,000 people that are only in that archive because they experienced lethal genocidal anti-Semitism in their lifetime and told that story. And so I'm so aware that that story needs to continue to be told. But the museums and the archives from which you've been hearing right now are right on the forefront with the public, ensuring that story is documented and ensuring it's there for future generations. Because if we know one thing for certain, anti-Semitism will be here for many generations to come. I'm sorry to have to end this session on that, but I want to thank our panelists, Susan Abrams and Mary Pat Higgins and Father Patrick Desbois, Tali Nates and Dr. Toby Simpson for being with us today. For the amazing work that you do, not only in documenting and teaching about the past, but also being on the front line in the present. It's always a pleasure to work with you in this terrible fight that we have to fight.
And stay with me for just a moment, because I do think it should be said that documenting and learning about the history of the Holocaust as a history of individuals is an act of resistance against the Nazis' attempts to dehumanize and destroy the Jewish people. The essential work that each of you are doing in the collective role of Holocaust museums and collecting institutions around the world really is a gift to humanity, so thank you. I also, I want to just take a moment to personalize something and extend my congratulations and appreciation to Stephen Smith, who will be concluding his tenure at USC Shoah Foundation. Stephen, without question, your vision and your work will impact the future of Holocaust education for decades to come. So congratulations, and thank you, thank you, thank you. I recognize the enormity in time difference and time zones that each of you are calling in from and participating. This has been a wonderful conversation. I thank you so much for your time.